So one of the projects that's been on the agenda for quite some time now has been a clamp rack. And for whatever reason, I'm constantly putting it off. It isn't until one of these moments right here where I finally realize, you know what, maybe it's time to build one. So much like I do before I start any project, I hop over on the internet and Google search whatever it is I'm looking for. In this case, would happen to be, obviously, a clamp rack. So one thing that I had to keep in mind here was the spacing on the back panel for where I was actually going to mount it to the wall. I know that it has to be 16 inches on center because I've already checked that beforehand. And so I want to make sure that I can find a mark between the clamps where I'm not running into one of the vertical supports for the clamps. This little miniature square that I have here works out perfectly because it is exactly the 3/4 inch thickness and allows me to be able to transfer the lines onto the other side of where each vertical divider is going to be. Originally, the way I was going to mount the vertical supports that hold the clamps on to the back piece was just to screw them in from the back side. So, being that I already had the layout lines onto the front, I figured this would be the best time to do so. And to make sure that I had 4 evenly spaced screw holes, I found a number that was easily divisible by 5, drug the tape measure until I reached that number, made my 4 marks, and then transferred those marks across the front with my T-square. By having the layout marks of where all the dividers are going to be, it makes it super easy to center the 4 holes in the middle of where all the supports are going to be. And as long as I just drill through the front, I can then flip the board over, make the countersink, and when it comes time to mount each of the vertical supports, I know exactly where to put the screws in. This is a great time to use up scrap plywood or any scrap materials that I have lying around the shop. And it just so happened that I had these 2 pieces left over from the built-in project a few months back. I first took the pieces over to the table saw to rip them into the lengths I needed, and then over to the MFT table to cross-cut everything to the proper size. One of the handy features of the MFT table are the flag stops that you can set up to basically, once you get it set to the measurement that you want, you just basically set each board in place and cross-cut them without having to remeasure or making sure that they're all the same length. So the angle here is really sort of arbitrary. It's really just for looks and I guess a little bit of function because it sort of makes the vertical uprights a little less clunky. And so what I did is I just measured in 2 inches from the top and 2 inches from the back and drew a line connecting the 2 points. Now this is the first time I got to use the MFT table for cutting angles, and man was that handy. It's really nice. Once I had the pencil line drawn on there, I could move the angle protractor to where the line that I'd drawn lined up with the track, set everything, and then I could just make all the cuts one after another. Well, even though I have this whole fancy setup and I had it all obviously in place to make all the repeatable cuts, I still managed to screw this up. Because the pieces weren't square, the first piece, or actually the second piece that I put in place to get cut, I cut it on the wrong freaking side. Now for this project, I needed some of the timber lock screws to mount this thing to the wall because I knew it was going to be a lot of weight, and so I needed something substantial to hold it up. Because our local hardware store here in town didn't have any of them, I had to end up driving about an hour south of us to Lowe's to be able to get some. Now in that time, I got to thinking to myself, man, what would be another way to mount these vertical uprights to the backer piece? And that's when I got the bright idea to try sliding dovetails. Now, I'd never cut this joint before. Well, take that back. I had cut it once before practicing, but not actually in a project. So this was a lot of fun, and it was kind of sort of a trial and error thing, and I felt like there would be really no better way to be able to support all the weight of these clamps than an actual sliding dovetail that would lock the two pieces together. And I could still use the screws or the screw holes that I drilled earlier and still mount them with screws to sort of act as clamps while the glue dried. As far as getting the sliding dovetails to fit together properly, it was a lot of trial and error, but I'm fortunate enough to have this Incra setup, which allows me pretty much maximum adjustments as far as moving it in or out however much I need be to try to get each piece fitting properly. And so all it takes a little bit of time checking and rechecking each one of them until I get a nice slit fit. Before spreading the glue and mounting the vertical supports, I figured it would be the best time to go ahead and countersink and pre-drill for the mounting screws that I was going to mount this thing to the wall with. And I use a combination of the drill press and my coreless drill to do so. Most of the dividers slid right into place fairly easily, except for the last couple, and I really blame that on the inconsistencies in the plywood. It's something that I didn't pay attention to whenever I was cutting all the dovetails, and so I had to actually end up using my hammer to knock this thing into place. But it's a good time to learn this lesson now while I'm just working on a shop project. I had a scrap piece of oak lying around that I ripped down at the table saw and then cross-cut on the bandsaw to be able to use on the front of each vertical support to prevent the clamps from sliding off. To mount these to the uprights, I just spread a little bit of glue and some brad nails to hold them in place. So these last couple of scenes here went over about like a fart in a scuba helmet. Whatever. It got time to mount this thing to the wall. I barely had enough room to fit back in here, and I'm trying to hold this thing in place. I barely got enough room for the tripod to sit in there because my dust collector's in the way. I couldn't get enough leverage, or barely enough leverage, to drive the screws in. Luckily, I was able to lean against a plywood rack here, and I had my wife helping hold the tripod in place to get an overhead shot of actually driving the screws in. And when I was actually placing all these clamps up here, I kept dropping the damn things in the floor and bumbling over them again because I have so much crap in this corner of this tiny little shop that I could barely move. If you'd like a little more information on this build, you can check out the website article that I have written. I'll have a link to that either on the screen or in the description below. Be sure to follow us on all the social media sites. We're most active on Instagram. And as always, guys, happy trails. Thanks for watching.